This is the story of Richard Ramirez, often referred to as the Night Stalker, was a notorious American serial killer, rapist, and burglar who terrorized Southern California between 1984 and 1985. His crimes were marked by their brutality and randomness, targeting people of all ages and backgrounds. Ramirez's modus operandi included breaking into homes at night, often using a variety of weapons like guns, knives, and even a hammer. His victims were both men and women, with the attacks involving sexual assault, torture, and murder. On February 29, 1960, in the border city of El Paso, Texas, Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez entered a world already shadowed by dysfunction and violence. Born to Mexican immigrants Mercedes Munoz and Julian Tapia Ramirez, he was the youngest of 5 children in a household where poverty, abuse, and instability would form the toxic foundation of his earliest years. His father, a former police officer turned railway laborer, carried within him a violent alcoholism that would manifest in explosive fits of rage directed at his family. The circumstances of Richard's birth seemed to foretell the darkness that would follow. Mercedes Ramirez had worked in a boot factory during her pregnancy, exposing herself to chemical fumes that many would later theorize contributed to the neurological issues that plagued her youngest son. The child who would become the Night Stalker was born with a constellation of birth defects shared by his siblings, ranging from respiratory difficulties to bone deformities. The early years of Richard Ramirez's life were marked by a series of traumatic head injuries that would have profound implications for his psychological development. At the tender age of 2, a heavy dresser fell upon his head, leaving a significant laceration across his forehead that would require medical attention. This was merely the first of several serious head traumas that the young boy would endure. The most significant of these injuries occurred when Richard was 5 years old. While playing on a swing, he was knocked unconscious in an accident that fundamentally altered his neurological functioning. From this point forward, the boy began experiencing epileptic seizures, a condition that Dr. Michael Stone, a forensic psychiatrist who later studied the case, would identify as temporal lobe epilepsy. This particular form of epilepsy, Stone noted, was directly linked to increased aggressivity and hypersexuality, traits that would become horrifically evident in Ramirez's adult crimes. The Ramirez household was a cauldron of dysfunction where violence was not an aberration but a daily reality. Julian Ramirez's alcoholism fueled volcanic eruptions of rage that left lasting scars on all his children. The patriarch of the family would beat his children with whatever implements were at hand, sometimes using a water hose as a weapon of punishment. The violence was so severe that Richard's siblings would often hide when their father's temper exploded, knowing that any one of them could become the target of his wrath. Perhaps most disturbing was Julian's use of religious imagery as a tool of psychological torture. When young Richard misbehaved, his father would tie him to a crucifix in a local cemetery overnight as punishment, a grotesque perversion of religious symbolism that would later manifest in Richard's own twisted relationship with Satanism. These nocturnal vigils among the dead became so frequent that Richard eventually began sleeping in the cemetery voluntarily, finding more peace among tombstones than in his own home. As forensic psychologist Gary Bricado would later observe, the dead are not going to fly off the handle and hurt you. The most catastrophic influence in young Richard's life came not from his immediate family, but from his older cousin, Miguel "Mike" Valles, a Vietnam War veteran whose own psychological wounds would become the catalyst for Richard's transformation into a killer. Miguel had returned from the war carrying within him the scars of combat and the darkness of unspeakable acts committed in the jungles of Southeast Asia. When Richard was approximately 12 years old, Miguel took him under his wing in what would prove to be the most damaging mentorship in criminal history. Miguel was not content to simply share war stories with his impressionable young cousin. Instead, he provided detailed accounts of the atrocities he had committed against Vietnamese civilians, complete with photographic evidence that would haunt Richard for the rest of his life. The photographs Miguel showed Richard depicted Vietnamese women who had been raped, tortured, murdered, and dismembered. Many of these images showed victims tied to trees or wooden posts both before and after they had been sexually assaulted and killed. Rather than being repulsed by these horrific images, Richard found himself fascinated by them. Years later, while incarcerated, he would tell investigators that he was fascinated, rather than repulsed, by the images and stories that Miguel shared with him. But Miguel's corruption of his young cousin extended beyond mere photography. He taught Richard stealth techniques and killing methods that he had learned in Vietnam, skills that Richard would later employ with devastating effectiveness during his killing spree. Miguel also shared his philosophy of violence, telling Richard that there's no thrill like a good kill, words that would echo in Richard's mind for years to come. The relationship between Miguel and Richard reached its horrific crescendo on a day that would forever alter the trajectory of both their lives. When Richard was 15 years old, he witnessed Miguel shoot and kill his wife, Jessie, during a domestic argument. The murder occurred in front of Richard, providing him with his first direct exposure to the reality of violent death. In what can only be described as a miscarriage of justice, Miguel was found not guilty by reason of insanity and was released after serving only 4 years in a mental institution. This outcome sent a chilling message to young Richard about the consequences, or lack thereof, for violent crime. The system had essentially validated Miguel's actions, and by extension, the violent worldview he had been instilling in his impressionable cousin. As Richard entered his teenage years, the cumulative effects of his traumatic childhood began to manifest in increasingly destructive behaviors. His academic performance deteriorated rapidly, and he dropped out of high school in the 9th grade. The young man who had once served as an altar boy in the Catholic Church was transforming into something darker and more dangerous. Richard's first recorded encounter with the criminal justice system came in 1977, when he was arrested for marijuana possession. This relatively minor offense marked the beginning of a pattern of criminal behavior that would escalate over the years. He also attempted to commit rape when he was 15, but the charges were dropped when the victim refused to return to El Paso to testify against him. By 1982, at the age of 22, Richard Ramirez had made the decision that would prove catastrophic for the people of California. He moved from El Paso to Los Angeles. The transition from the relatively small border town to the sprawling metropolis of Los Angeles provided Richard with the anonymity and opportunities he needed to pursue his darkest impulses. Los Angeles in the early 1980s was a city in transition. The successful hosting of the 1984 Olympics had brought international attention and a sense of civic pride, while crime rates had actually decreased to historically low levels. This apparent safety and security created a false sense of confidence among residents, a complacency that would make them vulnerable to the predator now living among them. Richard quickly established a pattern of life that would support his criminal activities. He lived as a drifter, moving frequently between various locations and supporting himself primarily through burglary. His drug use, which had begun with marijuana in his early teens, escalated dramatically. He developed a severe cocaine addiction that would consume up to $500 worth of the drug per day, a habit that necessitated frequent thefts to maintain. The drug use was not merely recreational but represented a form of self-medication for the psychological trauma and neurological damage he had sustained throughout his childhood. The cocaine, combined with other substances including PCP, angel dust, contributed to increasingly erratic and violent behavior. The side effects of angel dust, hallucinations, and increased aggression may have played a role in the escalation of his criminal activities. Chapter 2. The Making of a Killer, Psychological Development, 1982 to 1984. During his early years in Los Angeles, Richard Ramirez began developing what would become his signature calling card, an obsession with Satanism and the occult. This was not a casual interest in alternative spirituality, but rather a fundamental rejection of the Catholic faith in which he had been raised and a deliberate embrace of its antithesis. The roots of this transformation can be traced back to his childhood trauma and the religious abuse he had suffered at the hands of his father. The crucifix punishments and the perverted use of religious imagery had created a deep-seated resentment toward traditional Christianity. In Satanism, Richard found not just rebellion but a philosophical framework that seemed to justify the violent impulses that had been growing within him since childhood. His adoption of satanic beliefs was not merely symbolic. Richard immersed himself in occult literature and practices, developing a personal mythology that cast him as an agent of evil. This belief system would later manifest in the satanic symbols he left at crime scenes, including pentagram drawings at various locations. The pentagram became his signature, a deliberate message that these crimes were not random acts of violence, but calculated expressions of his dark faith. Before becoming the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez spent considerable time honing his criminal skills through a series of burglaries and minor offenses. These early crimes served as a training ground where he learned to move silently through residential neighborhoods, identify vulnerable targets, and evade detection. His methods during this period were primarily focused on theft rather than violence. Richard would target homes in middle-class neighborhoods, looking for easy entry points and valuable items that could be quickly converted to cash to support his drug habit. However, even during these relatively minor crimes, there were hints of the violence to come. Witnesses and surviving victims would later describe encounters with a man who seemed to take pleasure in terrorizing his victims beyond what was necessary for simple theft. The transition from burglary to violence was gradual, but inexorable. Richard's drug use was escalating his need for money, while simultaneously eroding whatever moral restraints might have prevented him from harming his victims. The combination of financial desperation, substance abuse, and deep-seated psychological damage created the perfect storm that would soon unleash unprecedented terror upon California. On June 28, 1984, Richard Ramirez crossed the line from petty criminal to killer with the murder of 79-year-old Jenny Vincow in her Glassell Park apartment. This crime would later be recognized as the first in what would become known as the Night Stalker series, though it would take over a year before investigators connected it to the subsequent murders. The murder of Jenny Vincow established the pattern that would characterize many of Ramirez's subsequent crimes. He gained entry to her ground-floor apartment by removing a window screen, a method that left his fingerprints on the frame, though this evidence would not be matched to him until after his capture. Once inside, he encountered the elderly woman and subjected her to a brutal attack that went far beyond what was necessary for robbery. Vincow was stabbed multiple times in her upper chest, neck, arm, and leg, with defensive wounds on her hands indicating that she had attempted to fight off her attacker. Her throat was slashed almost from ear to ear, and there were clear signs that she had been sexually assaulted after death. The level of violence was shocking even to experienced homicide detectives, who recognized that they were dealing with a perpetrator capable of extraordinary cruelty. The crime scene revealed both the brutality and the disorganization that would characterize many of Ramirez's early attacks. The apartment had been ransacked, with personal belongings scattered throughout the living room. The missing window screen was found on the floor, and the front door had been left unlocked, details that suggested the killer had been more focused on the violence than on covering his tracks. Following the Vincow murder, Richard Ramirez entered what criminologists would later identify as a cooling-off period common among serial killers. For nearly 9 months, there were no known murders attributable to the Night Stalker, though this does not mean that Richard was inactive during this time. He continued his pattern of burglaries and minor crimes, and may have committed other violent acts that were not immediately connected to the emerging pattern. During this period, Richard's psychological state continued to deteriorate. His drug use reached dangerous levels, with reports suggesting that he was consuming massive quantities of cocaine on a daily basis. The financial pressure to support this habit drove him to commit increasingly bold burglaries, bringing him into contact with more potential victims and increasing his confidence in his ability to evade capture. The combination of drugs, psychological instability, and growing confidence created the conditions for what would become one of the most terrifying crime sprees in American history. When Richard finally emerged from his cooling-off period in early 1985, he had evolved from a disorganized killer into a more methodical and dangerous predator. #, Chapter 3. The Reign of Terror begins, March 1985. On March 17, 1985, Richard Ramirez emerged from his months-long hiatus with a double attack that would mark the beginning of his most intensive period of violence. The events of that night would introduce the public to the reality of the Night Stalker, though he had not yet earned that notorious moniker. The evening began in Rosemead, where 22-year-old law student Maria Hernandez was returning home to the condominium she shared with her roommate, 34-year-old Dale Okazaki. As Hernandez pulled into the garage of their residence, she was confronted by a man who would later be identified as Richard Ramirez. The attacker approached her vehicle and fired a shot that struck her in the hand, causing her to fall to the ground. In a stroke of fortune that likely saved her life, the bullet that struck Hernandez was deflected by the keys she had been holding, reducing the severity of the wound. Ramirez, apparently believing he had killed her, proceeded into the condominium where he encountered Okazaki. The roommate was shot to death in what appeared to be an execution-style killing, with Ramirez showing no hesitation in taking the life of someone who posed no threat to him. Maria Hernandez, despite her injuries, had the presence of mind to remain still and pretend to be dead until she was certain her attacker had left the scene. Her survival would prove crucial to the investigation, as she became the first person to provide police with a detailed description of the man who would become known as the Night Stalker. Her testimony would later prove instrumental in identifying and convicting Richard Ramirez. Less than an hour after the attack on Hernandez and the murder of Okazaki, Richard Ramirez struck again. His second victim of the evening was 30-year-old Celia Yu, who was returning to her home in Monterey Park when she was approached by the killer. The proximity of this second attack to the first, only 2 miles away, suggested that the perpetrator was familiar with the area and was operating within a specific geographic comfort zone. Yu was dragged from her car near her home and shot multiple times. Unlike the relatively quick killing of Okazaki, the attack on Yu appeared to involve a degree of sadistic pleasure that would become characteristic of Ramirez's crimes. She died the following day from her injuries, but not before providing some information to police about her attacker. The two attacks on March 17, 1985, represented a significant escalation in Richard Ramirez's criminal behavior. The willingness to commit 2 separate attacks in a single night, combined with the geographical proximity of the crimes, demonstrated a level of confidence and audacity that would characterize his subsequent crime spree. The attacks also established a pattern of targeting women, often in residential settings where they should have felt safe. The double murder on March 17, 1985, attracted significant media attention, though investigators had not yet recognized that they were dealing with a serial killer. The initial coverage focused on the apparent randomness of the attacks and the brutality displayed by the perpetrator. Local news outlets began referring to the unknown suspect as the Valley Intruder, a name that reflected the geographical area where the attacks had occurred. The media coverage had the unintended consequence of increasing public awareness and fear throughout the San Gabriel Valley. Residents who had previously felt secure in their homes began taking additional precautions, though many did not yet understand the full scope of the threat they were facing. Gun stores and home security companies reported increased sales as residents sought to protect themselves from an unknown predator. However, the true magnitude of the terror that was about to unfold remained hidden from the public. The media and law enforcement alike were operating under the assumption that they were dealing with isolated crimes rather than the beginning of an unprecedented killing spree. 10 days after the attacks on Hernandez, Okazaki, and Yu, Richard Ramirez demonstrated that his capacity for violence was continuing to escalate. On March 27, 1985, he broke into the Whittier home of 64-year-old Vincent Zazera and his 44-year-old wife, Maxine. This attack would introduce a level of sadistic brutality that shocked even experienced homicide investigators. The crime began when Ramirez encountered Vincent Zazera, who was sleeping on the couch in the living room. Ramirez shot the older man to death, then proceeded to search the house for other occupants. He found Maxine Zazera, who attempted to defend herself with a shotgun that the couple kept in their home. Unfortunately for Maxine, the weapon failed to fire, leaving her defenseless against her attacker. What followed was an act of violence so extreme that it would become one of the defining characteristics of the Night Stalker case. After shooting Maxine Zazera 3 times, Ramirez subjected her body to a form of mutilation that revealed the depth of his psychological disturbance. He gouged out both of her eyes and took them with him as grotesque souvenirs of the attack. The removal of the victim's eyes served multiple purposes for Ramirez. From a practical standpoint, he may have believed in the folk superstition that the eyes retain the image of the last thing a person sees before death, though this belief has no basis in medical science. More significantly, the mutilation represented a form of post-mortem torture that satisfied his sadistic impulses and demonstrated his complete dehumanization of his victims. The Zazera murders marked a turning point in the Night Stalker case. The level of violence and the bizarre mutilation convinced investigators that they were dealing with a perpetrator who was capable of extreme cruelty and who was likely to continue killing unless stopped. The case also demonstrated that no one was safe from the Night Stalker's attacks. Vincent Zazera had been a successful businessman who lived in a relatively affluent neighborhood, yet this had provided no protection against the predator stalking through suburban California. The Zazera murders, combined with the earlier attacks, finally convinced law enforcement officials that they were dealing with a serial killer rather than isolated incidents. The Los Angeles Police Department and the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department began coordinating their investigations, sharing information and resources in an attempt to identify the perpetrator. The investigation was led by two experienced detectives who would become central figures in the Night Stalker case: Los Angeles County Sheriff's Detective Gil Carrillo and LAPD Detective Frank Salerno. Carrillo, the younger of the two, brought fresh eyes and innovative thinking to the investigation. Salerno, who had previously worked on the Hillside Strangler case, provided the experience and expertise necessary to coordinate a complex multi-jurisdictional investigation. The two detectives faced an enormous challenge. The attacks appeared to be random, with no obvious connection between the victims. The perpetrator was moving freely throughout the greater Los Angeles area, striking in different jurisdictions and using various methods of attack. Most troubling of all, the violence was escalating with each attack, suggesting that the killer was becoming more confident and more dangerous. The formation of what would eventually become known as the Night Stalker Task Force represented one of the largest and most intensive criminal investigations in Southern California history. Multiple agencies contributed personnel and resources to the effort, with investigators working around the clock to identify and apprehend the killer. However, despite their best efforts, Richard Ramirez remained one step ahead of law enforcement, and his reign of terror was far from over. Hashtag Chapter 4. The Summer of Fear, April. August 1985. As spring turned to summer in 1985, Richard Ramirez's attacks became both more frequent and more savage. On May 14, 1985, he targeted the home of 66-year-old Bill Doy and his disabled wife, 56-year-old Lillian Doy, in Monterey Park. This attack would demonstrate both the evolving nature of Ramirez's methods and his willingness to target the most vulnerable members of society. Ramirez entered the Doy residence during the early morning hours, encountering Bill Doy in the bedroom. When the older man reached for his own handgun in an attempt to defend himself and his wife, Ramirez shot him in the face with a .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol. The attack was swift and merciless, designed to neutralize any potential resistance before proceeding with his true objectives. After beating Bill Doy unconscious, Ramirez moved to the bedroom where he found Lillian Doy, who was disabled and unable to flee or defend herself. He bound her with thumb cuffs, then subjected her to a sexual assault while her husband lay dying nearby. The choice to assault a disabled woman while her husband was mortally wounded revealed the depth of Ramirez's cruelty and his complete lack of human empathy. Bill Doy died from his injuries while hospitalized, making this another double murder in the Night Stalker series. The attack on the Doy family was particularly shocking to the local community because it demonstrated that even couples who attempted to protect themselves with firearms were not safe from the Night Stalker. The speed and viciousness of the attack had overwhelmed any defensive measures the victims had tried to implement. 2 weeks after the Doy murders, on May 29, 1985, Richard Ramirez committed one of his most disturbing attacks, introducing a new element that would become his signature: satanic symbolism. The victims were 83-year-old Mabel Ma Bell and her disabled sister, 81-year-old Florence Nettie Lang, who lived together in Monrovia. Ramirez entered the sisters' home and found a hammer in the kitchen, which he used to bludgeon both elderly women. The violence was so extreme that he actually broke the handle of the hammer during the attack. Both women were found bound and severely beaten, with injuries so extensive that they lapsed into comas. However, it was not the physical violence alone that made this attack so significant in the Night Stalker case. After raping Florence Lang, Ramirez used Mabel Bell's lipstick to draw pentagram symbols on her thigh and on the walls of both bedrooms. This was the first documented use of satanic symbolism in the Night Stalker crimes, and it added a new dimension of terror to an already horrifying case. The pentagrams were not random graffiti, but deliberate religious symbols that reflected Ramirez's embrace of Satanism. By leaving these marks at the crime scene, he was making a statement about his beliefs and his identity as a servant of evil. The symbolism would become a recurring theme in subsequent attacks, helping investigators to link crimes and providing insight into the killer's psychological motivations. Both sisters were found 2 days later, still alive but comatose and critically injured. Florence Lang survived her injuries, though she would never fully recover from the trauma. Mabel Bell died on July 15th, succumbing to the severe injuries inflicted during the attack. The survival of Florence Lang provided investigators with another witness, though her injuries prevented her from providing detailed information about her attacker. On July 7, 1985, Richard Ramirez demonstrated his unpredictability by changing his method of killing in the murder of 60-year-old Joyce Lucille Nelson in Monterey Park. Instead of using firearms or knives as he had in previous attacks, Ramirez beat Nelson to death by repeatedly stomping on her face. The murder of Joyce Nelson was particularly brutal even by Night Stalker standards. Nelson was found in her living room, where she had apparently been sleeping on the couch when Ramirez entered her home. The killer left a distinctive footprint from an obvious sneaker imprinted on her face, a piece of evidence that would later prove crucial in linking him to the crime. The footprint evidence represented a significant breakthrough for investigators. The obvious sneaker was a relatively new brand in the United States, and only one pair in that size had been sold in the Los Angeles area. This gave investigators their first concrete lead that could potentially be traced back to the killer. However, the breakthrough would not lead to an immediate arrest, as Ramirez had purchased the shoes using cash and had provided no identifying information. The Nelson murder also revealed the psychological satisfaction that Ramirez derived from violence itself. Unlike previous attacks that had included sexual assault or theft as apparent motives, the murder of Joyce Nelson appeared to be motivated primarily by the killer's desire to inflict pain and death. This suggested that the Night Stalker was evolving from a criminal who used violence as a means to an end into someone who found violence to be an end in itself. July 20th, 1985, would prove to be one of the most devastating days in the Night Stalker's reign of terror, with Richard Ramirez committing murders at two separate locations and demonstrating a level of violence that shocked even seasoned investigators. The day's events would establish him as one of the most dangerous serial killers in American history. The first attack occurred in Glendale, where Ramirez targeted the home of 66-year-old Lela Needing and her 68-year-old husband, Maxon Needing. Before approaching their home, Ramirez had purchased a machete, indicating premeditation and an intent to inflict maximum violence. The weapon choice suggested that he was escalating not just in frequency, but in the level of brutality he was willing to employ. Ramirez burst into the sleeping couple's bedroom in the early morning hours and immediately began attacking them with a machete. The assault was swift and merciless, with both victims being hacked repeatedly before Ramirez finished them off with shots to the head from a .22 caliber handgun. The combination of blade and gunshot wounds created a crime scene of extraordinary violence that would haunt investigators for years. After killing the Needings, Ramirez spent additional time mutilating their bodies with a machete, an act that served no practical purpose, but satisfied his sadistic impulses. He then robbed the house of valuables before quickly fencing the stolen items to obtain cash. The speed with which he disposed of the stolen goods suggested both criminal experience and a pressing need for money to support his drug habit. But Ramirez's night of violence was far from over. After completing the attack on the Needings, he drove to Sun Valley in Los Angeles, where he broke into the home of the Covenant family. The family included 32-year-old Chaineron Covenant, his wife Somkid, also 32, and their young son. Ramirez shot Chaineron Covenant in the head with a .22 caliber handgun, killing him instantly. He then turned his attention to Somkid Covenant, subjecting her to repeated rape and beatings while her 8-year-old son was bound and forced to witness the attack. The decision to leave the child alive, but traumatized, revealed a calculated cruelty that went beyond simple murder. During the assault on Somkid Covenant, Ramirez introduced another element that would become characteristic of his crimes. He demanded that she swear to Satan that she was not hiding any money from him. This forced invocation of his satanic beliefs demonstrated the importance of his dark faith in the commission of his crimes. It also served to further terrorize his victims by introducing a supernatural element to an already horrifying experience. The two attacks on July 20th resulted in 3 deaths and left multiple survivors traumatized for life. The sheer scope of violence committed in a single night demonstrated that the Night Stalker was operating at a level of intensity that was unprecedented in the annals of serial crime. The attacks also showed that he was becoming more confident and more willing to take risks, factors that would ultimately contribute to his capture. By late July 1985, the Night Stalker case had captured the attention of media outlets throughout California and beyond. The combination of random victims, extreme violence, and satanic symbolism created a perfect storm of public fascination and terror. News coverage of the crimes became increasingly sensationalized, with headlines emphasizing the most shocking details of each attack. The media attention had both positive and negative effects on the investigation. On the positive side, widespread coverage increased public awareness and led to numerous tips from citizens who believed they had encountered the Night Stalker. The publicity also put pressure on law enforcement agencies to coordinate their efforts and devote additional resources to the case. However, the intense media coverage also created significant problems for investigators. Details about the crimes that should have been kept confidential were often revealed in news reports, potentially compromising the investigation. The coverage also created a climate of fear that sometimes led to false reports and hysteria, making it difficult for police to separate legitimate leads from panic-driven speculation. The public response to the Night Stalker case was unprecedented in its intensity. Gun stores throughout Southern California reported massive increases in sales as residents sought to arm themselves against the unknown killer. Home security companies experienced similar surges in business as people installed alarms, additional locks, and other protective measures. Perhaps most telling was the change in daily behavior patterns throughout the affected communities. People who had previously felt safe leaving windows open on hot summer nights began sealing their homes despite the heat. Many residents arranged to sleep in groups rather than alone, and some actually relocated temporarily to stay with friends or family in areas that were perceived to be safer. The Night Stalker had succeeded in terrorizing an entire metropolitan area with a population of millions. The randomness of his attacks meant that no one could feel truly safe, regardless of their age, gender, or economic status. The fear was so pervasive that it began to affect the economic and social life of Southern California, with some businesses reporting decreased activity during evening hours. As the body count continued to rise throughout the summer of 1985, law enforcement agencies found themselves under increasing pressure to solve the Night Stalker case. The multi-jurisdictional nature of the crimes created coordination challenges, while the apparent randomness of the attacks made traditional investigative methods difficult to apply. Detective Gil Carrillo and Detective Frank Salerno had become the public faces of the investigation, regularly briefing the media and reassuring the public that everything possible was being done to capture the killer. However, behind the scenes, both men were feeling the enormous weight of responsibility that came with hunting one of the most dangerous criminals in American history. The investigation was consuming vast resources from multiple agencies. Teams of detectives were working around the clock, following up on hundreds of tips and leads. Crime scene technicians were processing evidence using the most advanced forensic techniques available, including the newly implemented automated fingerprint identification system, AFIS, that would eventually prove crucial to solving the case. Despite these efforts, Richard Ramirez remained one step ahead of law enforcement. His ability to strike randomly throughout the greater Los Angeles area made it nearly impossible to predict where he would attack next. His use of different weapons and methods also made it difficult to anticipate his behavior or develop effective countermeasures. The pressure on investigators was not just professional, but deeply personal. Both Carrillo and Salerno had families of their own, and they understood the fear that was gripping the communities they served. The knowledge that their failure to capture the Night Stalker could result in more innocent deaths added an emotional dimension to an already challenging investigation. Hashtag Chapter 5. The hunt intensifies. August 1985. On August 6, 1985, Richard Ramirez attempted what would have been another double murder when he broke into the Northridge home of 30-year-old Chris Peterson and 27-year-old Virginia Peterson. However, this attack would prove to be different from his previous crimes because both victims survived, providing investigators with crucial eyewitness testimony about the Night Stalker's methods and appearance. Ramirez crept into the Peterson bedroom during the early morning hours and startled Virginia Peterson awake. Without warning, he shot her in the face with a .25 caliber semi-automatic handgun. The bullet caused severe injuries, but did not kill her immediately. When Chris Peterson attempted to come to his wife's aid, Ramirez shot him in the neck. What followed was a life-and-death struggle that demonstrated both the Peterson couple's courage and Ramirez's determination to kill. Despite his gunshot wound, Chris Peterson fought back against his attacker, avoiding 2 additional shots during a struggle that allowed Ramirez to escape but prevented him from finishing off his intended victims. The couple's survival was due to a combination of their own resistance and Ramirez's apparent decision that the fight was not worth the risk of being caught. Both Chris and Virginia Peterson survived their injuries and were able to provide detailed descriptions of their attacker to investigators. Their testimony added crucial information to the growing profile of the Night Stalker, including details about his physical appearance, his weapon preferences, and his behavior during attacks. The Peterson case also demonstrated that the Night Stalker could be fought off if victims were willing and able to resist. 2 nights after the Peterson attack, Richard Ramirez struck again with the murder of 31-year-old Elias Abawath and the sexual assault of his wife, 27-year-old Sakina Abawath, at their home in Diamond Bar. This attack would prove significant not only for its brutality, but also for the evidence it would eventually provide to investigators. Ramirez entered the Abawath home sometime after 2:30 a.m. and went directly to the master bedroom. He encountered Elias Abawath first, killing him instantly with a shot to the head from a .25 caliber handgun. The quick elimination of the male victim had become a standard part of Ramirez's method, allowing him to focus his attention on terrorizing and assaulting the female victims. After killing Elias, Ramirez turned his attention to Sakina Abawath, handcuffing and beating her while demanding information about the location of the family's jewelry and money. He then subjected her to a brutal rape while her 3-year-old son was present in the room. The decision to traumatize a young child in this manner revealed the depth of Ramirez's callousness and his complete disregard for human suffering. Throughout the assault, Ramirez repeatedly demanded that Sakina Abawath swear on Satan that she would not scream during his attacks. This forced invocation of his satanic beliefs had become a regular feature of his crimes, serving both to terrorize his victims and to reinforce his own dark religious identity. When the couple's 3-year-old son entered the bedroom during the assault, Ramirez tied the child up and continued his attack. After completing the assault, Ramirez stole various items from the home and fled. Sakina Abawath managed to untie herself and her son, then sent the child to neighbors for help. Her survival and ability to provide testimony would prove crucial to the investigation, as she could describe both the attacker's physical appearance and his specific behaviors and statements. The Abawath case was significant for several reasons beyond the immediate tragedy. The attack occurred in Orange County, expanding the geographical scope of the Night Stalker investigation and requiring coordination between additional law enforcement agencies. The case also provided evidence that would later be crucial in linking Ramirez to the crimes, including fingerprints and other physical evidence left at the scene. Perhaps most importantly, the Abawath murder marked the point at which Richard Ramirez, who had been closely following news coverage of his crimes, decided that the intensity of the investigation in Los Angeles required him to expand his hunting grounds. His next move would take him north to the San Francisco Bay Area, where he would attempt to continue his killing spree in unfamiliar territory. As media coverage of the Night Stalker case reached a fever pitch in August 1985, Richard Ramirez made the strategic decision to temporarily leave the Los Angeles area and continue his crimes in San Francisco. This move was likely motivated by the increasing law enforcement presence in Southern California and his recognition that his continued presence there was becoming too dangerous. The decision to move to San Francisco demonstrated both Ramirez's criminal intelligence and his compulsive need to continue killing. Rather than lying low or leaving the state entirely, he chose to relocate to another major California metropolitan area where he could continue his predatory activities. This choice would ultimately prove to be a crucial mistake that would provide investigators with the evidence needed to identify him. Ramirez's knowledge of San Francisco was limited compared to his familiarity with Los Angeles, where he had spent several years learning the geography and developing his criminal methods. This unfamiliarity would make him more likely to make mistakes and would reduce his ability to evade capture if law enforcement began closing in. However, his confidence in his abilities and his compulsive need to kill outweighed these practical considerations. On August 17, 1985, Richard Ramirez announced his presence in the San Francisco Bay Area with the brutal murder of 66-year-old Peter Pan and 64-year-old Barbara Pan at their home in the Lake Merced area. The attack would prove to be remarkably similar to his Los Angeles crimes, demonstrating that changing locations had not altered his methods or reduced his capacity for violence. Ramirez entered the Pan residence during the early morning hours, using his standard method of forced entry. He encountered Peter Pan first, shooting him to death before turning his attention to Barbara Pan. The attack followed the same pattern that had characterized his Los Angeles crimes. Quick elimination of the male victim followed by prolonged assault on the female victim. After killing both victims, Ramirez left his signature pentagram symbol at the crime scene, indicating that this was indeed a Night Stalker attack rather than an unrelated crime. The satanic symbolism served both as a personal signature and as a message to law enforcement that the killer had expanded his territory. The discovery of the pentagram immediately alerted San Francisco investigators that the Night Stalker had arrived in their jurisdiction. The Pan murders created an immediate sensation in the San Francisco media and caused panic among Bay Area residents. The realization that the Night Stalker was no longer confined to Southern California meant that no one in the state could consider themselves truly safe from his attacks. The case also required San Francisco law enforcement to coordinate with their counterparts in Los Angeles, sharing information and resources in an unprecedented multi-jurisdictional investigation. Richard Ramirez's decision to expand his crimes to San Francisco would ultimately provide investigators with the break they needed to identify him. On August 28, 1985, a stolen car that had been linked to one of the Night Stalker attacks was recovered in a parking lot near Mission Viejo in Orange County. The vehicle would prove to contain the evidence that would finally put a name to the Night Stalker. The car, a Toyota station wagon, had been abandoned by Ramirez after his final attack. Despite his experience as a criminal, he had made a crucial error. He had left fingerprints on the rearview mirror of the vehicle. When crime scene technicians processed the car using advanced laser technology, they were able to lift a clear fingerprint that was suitable for comparison. The fingerprint was immediately sent to the California Department of Justice Laboratory in Sacramento, where it was processed using the newly implemented Automated Fingerprint Identification System, AFIS. This state-of-the-art computer system was capable of searching through millions of fingerprint records in a matter of minutes, a task that would have taken human technicians months or years to complete manually. The AFIS search produced remarkable results. Within 14 minutes, the computer had identified Richard Ramirez as a match for the fingerprint found in the stolen car. His fingerprints were on file because of previous arrests for traffic violations and minor crimes in Los Angeles. For the first time since the Night Stalker case began, investigators had a name and a face to go with their suspect. The identification of Richard Ramirez represented a watershed moment in the Night Stalker investigation. After months of frustration and escalating violence, law enforcement finally knew who they were hunting. However, the identification also created a new set of challenges. Ramirez was still at large, still armed, and still extremely dangerous. The race was now on to capture him before he could kill again. With Richard Ramirez finally identified as the Night Stalker, law enforcement agencies throughout California launched one of the most intensive manhunts in the state's history. The investigation, which had already involved hundreds of officers from multiple agencies, now focused all of its resources on locating and apprehending a specific individual. The first step in the manhunt was the issuance of an all-points bulletin, APB, that included Ramirez's photograph and detailed description. The APB was distributed to every law enforcement agency in California and neighboring states, alerting officers to be on the lookout for one of the most dangerous criminals in American history. The bulletin emphasized that Ramirez should be considered armed and extremely dangerous, and that officers should use extreme caution if they encountered him. Investigators also began the process of tracing Ramirez's known associates and locations where he might seek shelter. His previous arrests in Los Angeles had provided information about his criminal network and the areas where he was known to operate. Teams of detectives began conducting surveillance on these locations and interviewing people who might have information about his whereabouts. However, the manhunt faced significant challenges. Ramirez was an experienced criminal who had evaded capture for over a year while committing multiple murders. He was familiar with law enforcement techniques and had demonstrated an ability to move freely throughout California without being detected. Most concerning of all, he had already shown a willingness to kill law enforcement officers if necessary, making any attempt to apprehend him extremely dangerous. The pressure on investigators to capture Ramirez quickly was enormous. Every day that he remained at large represented a potential threat to public safety. The media was covering the manhunt intensively, and the public was demanding results. For Detectives Carrillo and Salerno, who had been working the case for months, the identification of their suspect represented both a breakthrough and the beginning of the most critical phase of their investigation. On August 24, 1985, Richard Ramirez committed what would prove to be his final attack in the Night Stalker series. The victims were 29-year-old Inez Erickson and her fiancé, 30-year-old Bill Carnes, who were attacked in their home in Mission Viejo. This attack would provide crucial evidence for the investigation, while also demonstrating that Ramirez remained as dangerous as ever. Ramirez entered the Carnes-Erickson home through a back door during the early morning hours. He made his way to the bedroom where the couple was sleeping and awakened Carnes by cocking his .25 caliber handgun. Without hesitation, Ramirez shot Carnes 3 times in the head, causing severe injuries that left him fighting for his life. After shooting Carnes, Ramirez turned his attention to Erickson. In a departure from his usual practice of concealing his identity, he actually identified himself to his victim, telling her, "I am the Night Stalker." This revelation demonstrated his growing ego and his desire for recognition, factors that were beginning to override his sense of self-preservation. Ramirez subjected Erickson to a brutal assault, beating her with his fists and binding her with neckties from the closet. He then forced her to swear her love for Satan as he had done with previous victims. After sexually assaulting her, he ransacked the home for valuables while demanding that she tell him where cash and jewelry were hidden. Before leaving the scene, Ramirez made a statement that would become one of the most chilling quotes associated with the Night Stalker case. He told Erickson, "Tell them the Night Stalker was here." This message was clearly intended for law enforcement and demonstrated his desire to taunt the investigators who had been hunting him. Both victims survived the attack, though Bill Carnes suffered severe brain injuries that required multiple surgeries. Inez Erickson was able to provide detailed testimony about the attack, including Ramirez's self-identification as the Night Stalker. Her account would prove crucial in court proceedings, as it demonstrated Ramirez's awareness of his reputation and his pride in his criminal activities. The Mission Viejo attack also provided the physical evidence that would lead to Ramirez's identification. The stolen car he had used was found nearby and processed for fingerprints, yielding the crucial evidence that would finally put a name to the Night Stalker. However, by the time investigators made this connection, Ramirez had already fled the area and was making his way back to Los Angeles. Hashtag Chapter 6, The End of Terror, Capture and Arrest. August 31st, 1985. On the morning of August 30th, 1985, law enforcement made the critical decision to release Richard Ramirez's photograph to the media. This decision represented a calculated risk. While it might help the public identify and report the Night Stalker, it would also alert Ramirez that he had been identified and could cause him to flee the state or escalate his violence. The photograph, taken from Ramirez's previous arrest records, was distributed to every major news outlet in California. By the evening news broadcasts on August 30th, his face was being shown on television screens throughout the state. The following morning, August 31st, 1985, his photograph appeared on the front pages of newspapers across California, including the Los Angeles Times and other major dailies. The media response to the photograph release was unprecedented. Television stations interrupted regular programming to broadcast the image and warn viewers to be on the lookout for the Night Stalker. Radio stations provided regular updates, and newspapers printed special editions to ensure maximum distribution of the photograph. The goal was to saturate the media market so thoroughly that no one in California could avoid seeing Ramirez's face. The strategy proved to be exactly what was needed to end the Night Stalker's reign of terror. However, Ramirez himself was initially unaware that his photograph had been released. He had been visiting relatives in Arizona and was returning to Los Angeles on the morning of August 31st, unaware that he was now the most wanted man in California. On the morning of August 31st, 1985, Richard Ramirez made a fatal mistake that would lead to his capture. He stopped at a liquor store in East Los Angeles and saw his own face staring back at him from the front page of a Spanish-language newspaper. The headline identified him as El Matador, the killer. The moment of recognition was a turning point in the case. For over a year, Ramirez had operated with impunity, confident in his ability to avoid identification and capture. Now, suddenly, he realized that his anonymity was gone and that his face was known to millions of people throughout California. The psychological impact of this realization would contribute to the panicked behavior that would lead to his capture. A woman in the store recognized Ramirez from the newspaper photograph and shouted, "El Maton, the killer." This cry of recognition sent Ramirez fleeing from the store in a panic. For the first time since he had begun his killing spree, he was running from potential victims rather than stalking them. Ramirez's flight from the liquor store marked the beginning of a day-long chase through the streets of East Los Angeles. However, his panic and desperation would lead him to make increasingly poor decisions that would ultimately result in his capture by civilians rather than law enforcement. After fleeing the liquor store, Richard Ramirez found himself on foot in a neighborhood where his photograph had been widely circulated. His distinctive appearance, which had served him well during his crimes, now made him immediately recognizable to anyone who had seen the morning news or newspapers. In a desperate attempt to escape, Ramirez ran toward Interstate 5, apparently hoping to steal a vehicle and flee the area. However, his erratic behavior and obvious panic attracted attention from residents who had seen his photograph and were on the lookout for the Night Stalker. What followed was one of the most dramatic captures of a serial killer in American history. Ramirez spotted an unlocked red Ford Mustang and attempted to steal it. However, the owner's father, Faustino Pinion, witnessed the attempted theft and confronted the would-be carjacker. Despite knowing that he was facing one of the most dangerous criminals in American history, Pinion fought with Ramirez and prevented him from stealing the vehicle. The confrontation between Pinion and Ramirez attracted the attention of other neighborhood residents. As word spread that the Night Stalker had been spotted, more and more people joined the effort to subdue him. What began as a fight between two men quickly evolved into a mob action involving dozens of angry residents. The scene in East Los Angeles on August 31st, 1985, represented a remarkable moment of community solidarity in the face of terror. Residents who had lived in fear for over a year suddenly found themselves with the opportunity to take action against the man who had terrorized their communities. The response was swift, decisive, and overwhelming. As more neighbors joined the confrontation, Ramirez found himself outnumbered and unable to escape. The crowd that formed around him included men and women of all ages, united in their determination to prevent his escape. Some residents armed themselves with improvised weapons, including steel rods and other objects that could be used to subdue the killer. The beating that followed was severe enough that Ramirez was left bloodied and barely conscious. However, the mob's actions were restrained enough that they did not kill him, instead holding him until law enforcement could arrive. This restraint was remarkable given the level of fear and anger that the Night Stalker had generated throughout the community. During the beating, Ramirez repeatedly shouted, "Déjame en paz," "Déjame en paz," Spanish for "leave me in peace." The irony of this plea was not lost on the residents who had subdued him, as he had shown no mercy to his own victims over the previous year. When police finally arrived, Ramirez actually thanked them for rescuing him from the mob. When Los Angeles Police Department officers arrived at the scene, they found Richard Ramirez being held by an angry mob of residents. The man who had eluded the largest manhunt in California history had been captured not by law enforcement, but by ordinary citizens who had taken matters into their own hands. The arrest marked the end of one of the most terrifying crime sprees in American history. The responding officers immediately recognized the significance of the arrest. Captain Andres Ramirez, no relation to the killer, who was one of the sheriff's deputies who arrived at the scene, later recalled, "People were starting to shout, 'You got the guy. You got the Night Stalker.' It was like half the city of LA was looking for him." The formal arrest of Richard Ramirez occurred at approximately 3 p.m. on August 31st, 1985. He was taken into custody on multiple charges related to the Night Stalker case, including murder, rape, burglary, and attempted murder. The arrest brought an immediate sense of relief to communities throughout California that had lived in fear for over a year. News of the arrest spread rapidly throughout California and beyond. Television stations interrupted regular programming to announce that the Night Stalker had been captured. Radio stations provided continuous updates, and newspapers prepared special editions to cover the dramatic conclusion to the case. The sense of relief and celebration was palpable throughout the state. However, the arrest of Richard Ramirez marked not the end of the Night Stalker case, but rather the beginning of a new phase. Investigators now faced the challenge of building an airtight case against him, while the legal system prepared for what would become one of the most expensive and complex trials in California history. With Richard Ramirez finally in custody, investigators began the process of definitively linking him to the various Night Stalker crimes. The evidence that had accumulated over the course of the investigation was substantial, ranging from fingerprint evidence to eyewitness testimony from survivors. The most compelling evidence was the fingerprint match that had led to his identification. The print found on the stolen car used in the Mission Viejo attack was definitively matched to Ramirez, providing irrefutable proof of his involvement in at least one of the crimes. Additionally, investigators were able to match fingerprints found at several other crime scenes to Ramirez, creating a pattern of evidence that would be difficult to challenge in court. Eyewitness identification also played a crucial role in linking Ramirez to the crimes. Survivors of various attacks, including Maria Hernandez, Inez Erickson, and others, were able to identify him in police lineups. The consistency of these identifications, combined with the detailed descriptions that matched Ramirez's appearance, provided powerful corroborating evidence. Physical evidence found in Ramirez's possession or associated with him also connected him to the crimes. Items stolen from various crime scenes were found in the possession of his associates or had been traced through pawn shop records to him. Additionally, investigators found a car in the El Sereno area that was linked to Ramirez and contained a pentagram drawn on the dashboard, further connecting him to the satanic symbolism found at various crime scenes. The ballistics evidence also supported the case against Ramirez. Bullets recovered from various crime scenes were matched to the same weapons, and these weapons could be traced through various means to Ramirez. The consistency of the ballistics evidence helped establish that a single perpetrator was responsible for multiple attacks. One of the most significant developments following Ramirez's arrest was the connection investigators made between him and the murder of Jenny Vincao in June 1984. This case, which had occurred over a year before the recognized beginning of the Night Stalker series, had remained unsolved despite the obvious similarities to later attacks. After Ramirez's arrest and fingerprinting, investigators were able to match two of his prints to evidence found at the Vincao crime scene. The prints had been found on a window screen that had been removed to gain entry to Vincao's ground floor apartment. This evidence definitively linked Ramirez to what was now recognized as the first Night Stalker murder. The connection to the Vincao murder was significant for several reasons. First, it extended the timeline of Ramirez's known criminal activity and demonstrated that he had been active as a killer for longer than previously thought. Second, it provided additional murder charges that prosecutors could use in seeking the death penalty. Finally, it validated the investigative techniques that had been used throughout the case. The Vincao connection also provided insight into the evolution of Ramirez's criminal behavior. The murder showed many of the characteristics that would become his signature: forced entry through a window, extreme violence, and sexual assault. However, it lacked some of the more elaborate satanic symbolism that would characterize his later crimes, suggesting that his methods and psychological state had evolved over time. Hashtag Chapter 7. The Trial of the Century, 1988 to 1989. The legal proceedings against Richard Ramirez began almost immediately after his arrest, but the path to trial would prove to be long and complex. The case involved multiple jurisdictions, dozens of charges, and unprecedented media attention that created numerous challenges for both prosecution and defense. What should have been a straightforward criminal prosecution became one of the most complicated and expensive trials in California history. The first major challenge was determining which jurisdiction would prosecute the case. Ramirez had committed crimes in Los Angeles County, Orange County, and San Francisco, each of which had legitimate claims to prosecute. After extensive negotiations between prosecutors, it was decided that Los Angeles County would handle the majority of the charges, while the other jurisdictions would postpone their cases pending the outcome of the primary trial. The complexity of the charges also created significant pretrial challenges. Prosecutors ultimately decided to charge Ramirez with 43 felony counts, including 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary. Each charge required extensive preparation and documentation, creating a massive case file that would challenge both prosecution and defense teams. Jury selection proved to be particularly difficult due to the extensive media coverage the case had received. Finding jurors who had not been exposed to prejudicial information about Ramirez and his crimes was nearly impossible in Los Angeles County. The voir dire process took months as attorneys questioned hundreds of potential jurors about their knowledge of the case and their ability to remain impartial. The defense team, led by Daniel Hernandez and Arturo Hernandez, faced the enormous challenge of defending a client whose crimes had been extensively documented and who had been identified by multiple survivors. Their strategy would focus on challenging the eyewitness identifications and raising questions about the reliability of the physical evidence. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Phil Halpin, built their case methodically, presenting the 43 felony charges as 15 separate incidents in chronological order. This approach allowed jurors to see the pattern and escalation in Ramirez's criminal behavior while also demonstrating the consistency of his methods across multiple attacks. The presentation of evidence was extensive and graphic. Prosecutors used charts, maps, and color photographs to help jurors understand the scope and brutality of Ramirez's crimes. The photographs of crime scenes and victims were particularly disturbing, causing some jurors and courtroom observers to weep during testimony. Eyewitness testimony formed a crucial component of the prosecution's case. Survivors of various attacks took the stand to identify Ramirez and describe their ordeals. Maria Hernandez testified about the attack that killed her roommate Dale Okazaki. Inez Erickson described her assault and Ramirez's self-identification as the Night Stalker. Sakina Abawath recounted the murder of her husband and her own sexual assault. The forensic evidence presented by prosecutors was particularly compelling. Fingerprint experts testified about the matches between prints found at various crime scenes and Ramirez's known prints. Ballistics experts explained how bullets from different crime scenes had been fired from the same weapons. DNA evidence, which was still relatively new in criminal prosecutions, was also used to link Ramirez to several attacks. Perhaps most damaging to the defense was the testimony about Ramirez's behavior and statements during his crimes. Multiple survivors testified that he had forced them to swear allegiance to Satan during their assaults. This testimony not only corroborated the accounts of different victims, but also demonstrated the deliberate and ritualistic nature of many of his crimes. The defense team faced an almost impossible task in defending Richard Ramirez. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including fingerprints, eyewitness testimony, and physical evidence linking him to multiple crime scenes. Rather than claiming innocence, the defense focused on challenging the reliability of the evidence and raising questions about the investigation. Daniel Hernandez, who handled the cross-examination of witnesses, employed a strategy of attacking eyewitness identifications. He argued that the lighting conditions and traumatic circumstances of the attacks made reliable identification impossible. Expert witnesses testified about the unreliability of eyewitness testimony under stress and the potential for suggestion to influence identifications. The defense also challenged the fingerprint evidence, arguing that the processing and handling of evidence had not met proper standards. They raised questions about chain of custody and the potential for contamination or misidentification of prints. However, the sheer volume of fingerprint evidence made this line of defense difficult to sustain. In what would prove to be a controversial decision, the defense chose not to present evidence about Ramirez's troubled childhood or mental state. While such evidence might have provided mitigation during the penalty phase, the defense apparently believed that it would not be effective given the overwhelming evidence of guilt and the horrific nature of the crimes. Throughout the trial, Richard Ramirez's behavior in the courtroom became almost as much of a story as the evidence against him. His demeanor was consistently defiant and unrepentant, often displaying an arrogance that seemed to mock the proceedings and the suffering of his victims. Ramirez's most famous courtroom moment occurred during his arraignment, when he displayed a pentagram drawn on his palm and shouted, "Hail Satan," as he was led from the courtroom. This dramatic gesture made headlines throughout the country and reinforced his image as a devotee of evil. The pentagram had apparently been drawn in his own blood, adding an additional element of shock to the display. During the trial itself, Ramirez often appeared disinterested in the proceedings. He would slouch in his chair, make faces at witnesses, and generally behave as though the trial was an inconvenience rather than a matter of life and death. When survivors testified about their ordeals, he showed no emotion or remorse. Perhaps most disturbing was Ramirez's interaction with the female groupies who attended his trial. A number of women, many dressed in black and displaying their own satanic symbols, came to court regularly to show their support for him. Ramirez would acknowledge their presence, pulling his sunglasses down to make eye contact with them and generally behaving as though he was enjoying celebrity status. The groupie phenomenon added a surreal element to the proceedings. These women, who seemed to be attracted to Ramirez's notoriety and dark charisma, would later send him letters and gifts in prison. Some even claimed to be in love with him, demonstrating the disturbing psychological attraction that some people feel toward notorious criminals. After months of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached their verdict on September 20th, 1989. Richard Ramirez was found guilty on all 43 counts, including 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary. The unanimous verdict represented a complete victory for the prosecution and validation of the enormous investigative effort that had gone into building the case. The reading of the verdict was a dramatic moment in the courtroom. Spectators gasped as each guilty verdict was announced, and several family members of victims were seen crying with relief. For many, the verdict represented not just justice for the specific crimes, but vindication for the terror that had gripped their communities for over a year. Ramirez himself showed little emotion as the verdicts were read. True to form, he maintained his defiant demeanor and showed no signs of remorse or regret. His lack of reaction contrasted sharply with the emotional responses of victims' families and the obvious relief felt by investigators and prosecutors. The conviction on multiple murder charges with special circumstances made Ramirez eligible for the death penalty. However, the trial was far from over, as the penalty phase would require additional proceedings to determine whether he would be sentenced to death or life in prison without parole. The penalty phase of Richard Ramirez's trial began in October 1989, with both prosecution and defense declining to present witnesses. This unusual decision meant that the jury would base their sentencing recommendation solely on the evidence presented during the guilt phase of the trial. The prosecution argued that Ramirez deserved the death penalty based on the extreme cruelty and callousness of his crimes. They emphasized the multiple murders, the torture of victims, and the terror he had inflicted on entire communities. The prosecutors pointed to the special circumstances that had been proven, including multiple murders, burglary, rape, and the torture of victims. The defense pleaded with jurors to show mercy and spare Ramirez's life. However, their arguments were limited by their decision not to present mitigation evidence about his troubled childhood or mental state. Without such evidence, they could only ask the jury to reject the death penalty as a matter of principle. After 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned with their sentencing recommendation on October 4th, 1989. They recommended the death penalty on 19 separate counts, one of the largest death sentences ever handed down in California. The recommendation reflected the jury's belief that the crimes were so heinous that only the ultimate punishment was appropriate. The formal sentencing hearing took place on November 7, 1989, with Superior Court Judge Michael Tynan presiding. Before imposing sentence, the judge allowed Ramirez to make a statement to the court. What followed was one of the most chilling speeches ever delivered by a convicted killer. Ramirez's statement was filled with defiance and references to his satanic beliefs. He told the court, "You don't understand me. You are not expected to. You are not capable of it. I am beyond your experience. I am beyond good and evil. I will be avenged. Lucifer dwells in us all." The statement reinforced his image as an unrepentant servant of evil and showed no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. Judge Tynan responded by noting that there were no mitigating factors in any of Ramirez's crimes and that they displayed cruelty, callousness, and viciousness beyond any human understanding. He specifically cited Ramirez's gouging out of a victim's eyes and his use of satanic symbols at crime scenes as examples of the defendant's obscene behavior. The judge then formally imposed the death sentence, stating, It is the judgment and sentence of this court that Richard Ramirez shall suffer the death penalty. This penalty is to be inflicted within the walls of the state prison at San Quentin, California. The sentence meant that Ramirez would be transported to San Quentin's death row to await execution. As he was led from the courtroom for the final time, Ramirez made one last defiant gesture. He flashed a two-finger devil's horn sign and shouted, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory. I'll see you in Disneyland." Even facing the death penalty, he remained unrepentant and continued to mock the justice system and his victims. Hashtag Chapter 8. Death Row and the Final Years, 1989 to 2013. Following his sentencing, Richard Ramirez was transported to San Quentin State Prison, where he would spend the remainder of his life on death row. San Quentin, located north of San Francisco Bay, housed California's condemned inmates in conditions that were both secure and austere. For Ramirez, this represented the end of his freedom and the beginning of a long wait for an execution that would never come. Death row at San Quentin was a world unto itself, separated from the general prison population and operating under strict security protocols. Inmates were confined to their cells for most of each day, with limited opportunities for exercise, recreation, or social interaction. The environment was designed to be secure rather than comfortable, reflecting society's judgment that these prisoners had forfeited their right to normal human interaction. Ramirez's cell was approximately 48 square feet, containing a narrow bed, a toilet, a sink, and a small shelf for personal items. The walls were concrete, and the only natural light came from a small window that provided a limited view of the world outside. This would be his home for the next 24 years, a stark contrast to the freedom he had enjoyed while terrorizing California. Despite the restrictive environment, Ramirez adapted to life on death row with the same resilience he had shown throughout his criminal career. He established routines and found ways to occupy his time, including extensive correspondence with supporters and admirers. The fan mail he received was voluminous, demonstrating the disturbing fascination that some people felt for notorious criminals. One of the most bizarre aspects of Richard Ramirez's time on death row was his relationship with and eventual marriage to Doreen Leoie, a magazine editor who became obsessed with him after seeing his photograph on television. Their relationship began through correspondence and evolved into what Leoie claimed was genuine love. Doreen Leoie was a 41-year-old journalist and editor who had no previous connection to Ramirez or his crimes. She first saw his mugshot when police interrupted a television program she was watching to announce his identification as the Night Stalker. Rather than being repulsed by his crimes, she claimed to see vulnerability in his image. The correspondence between Leoie and Ramirez began in 1985 and continued for over a decade. She visited him regularly at San Quentin, often being among the first in line when visiting hours began. Their relationship developed over years of conversations through prison plexiglass, with Leoie gradually becoming more devoted to the convicted killer. On October 3, 1996, Leoie and Ramirez were married in a ceremony at San Quentin State Prison. The wedding was a surreal event that attracted significant media attention. Ramirez reportedly refused to wear a gold wedding band, saying Satanists don't wear gold, and opted for a platinum band instead. No one from Leoie's family attended the ceremony, though some of Ramirez's relatives were present. The marriage raised disturbing questions about the psychology of individuals who become romantically involved with notorious criminals. Leoie's devotion to Ramirez appeared to be genuine, but it also represented a profound disconnect from the reality of his crimes and the suffering he had caused. Her willingness to marry a man responsible for multiple murders and sexual assaults demonstrated the power of denial and the dangerous attraction some people feel toward evil. Following his conviction and death sentence, Richard Ramirez began the lengthy appeals process that is standard in California capital cases. His attorneys filed numerous motions challenging various aspects of his trial and conviction, arguing that errors had occurred that warranted either a new trial or a reduction in his sentence. The appeals process in capital cases is notoriously slow and complex, designed to ensure that no innocent person is executed. However, this system also means that condemned inmates can spend decades on death row while their cases work their way through the courts. For Ramirez, this meant that he would likely die of natural causes before any execution could be carried out. The California Supreme Court reviewed Ramirez's case as part of the automatic appeal process for death penalty cases. On August 7th, 2006, the court denied his first round of appeals, affirming both his conviction and his death sentence. The court found that the trial had been conducted fairly and that the evidence against Ramirez was overwhelming. In September 2006, Ramirez's attorneys requested a new hearing from the California Supreme Court, arguing that additional evidence had emerged that warranted reconsideration of his case. However, this request was also denied, leaving Ramirez with limited options for further appeals. His case would continue to work its way through the federal courts, but the prospects for success were minimal. As the years passed on death row, Richard Ramirez's health began to deteriorate significantly. The combination of aging, poor prison conditions, and the long-term effects of his previous drug abuse began to take a toll on his physical condition. By the 2000s, it was becoming clear that he was seriously ill. Ramirez was diagnosed with B-cell lymphoma, a form of blood cancer that affects the lymphatic system. This diagnosis was particularly significant because B-cell lymphoma can be associated with chronic hepatitis C infection, which Ramirez had contracted through his years of intravenous drug use. The cancer represented a serious threat to his life and required ongoing medical treatment. In addition to the lymphoma, Ramirez suffered from chronic substance abuse-related health problems and hepatitis C. The hepatitis C infection, which he had likely carried for decades, was gradually destroying his liver and contributing to his overall decline. Prison medical officials noted that his drug abuse had predated his incarceration and was the likely cause of his various health problems. The progression of Ramirez's illness meant that he spent increasing amounts of time in the prison medical facility rather than in his regular death row cell. San Quentin's medical facility was equipped to handle serious illnesses, but the level of care available in prison was necessarily limited compared to what he might have received in a civilian hospital. In 2009, more than 2 decades after Ramirez's conviction, investigators made a significant discovery that expanded the known scope of his crimes. DNA evidence collected from the 1984 murder of 9-year-old Mei Liang in San Francisco was matched to Ramirez, linking him to a crime that had remained unsolved for 25 years. The murder of Mei Liang had occurred on April 10, 1984, in the basement of a San Francisco apartment building. The 9-year-old girl had been sexually assaulted and murdered in a crime that bore similarities to Ramirez's known attacks, but had never been connected to the Night Stalker series. The discovery of his DNA at the scene proved that his criminal activities had begun earlier and included younger victims than previously known. The Liang case was significant for several reasons. It demonstrated that Ramirez had been active as a killer in San Francisco before the recognized beginning of his Southern California crime spree. It also showed that he was willing to target children, expanding the known scope of his predatory behavior. The case provided closure for the Liang family, who had waited over 25 years for justice. However, the DNA match came too late to affect Ramirez's legal situation. He had already been convicted and sentenced to death for his other crimes, and his health was declining rapidly. The new evidence served primarily to confirm what investigators had long suspected, that Richard Ramirez was responsible for more crimes than those for which he had been formally charged. The revelation about the Liang murder also had a profound impact on Doreen Leoie's relationship with her husband. According to reports, Leoie was deeply disturbed by the evidence that Ramirez had murdered a child, and this may have contributed to the apparent end of their marriage. While they never formally divorced, Leoie stopped visiting Ramirez and withdrew from public view after the DNA evidence was revealed. By 2013, Richard Ramirez's health had deteriorated to the point where death appeared imminent. The combination of B-cell lymphoma, hepatitis C, and other health problems had weakened him significantly. In early June 2013, his condition worsened to the point where he required hospitalization outside of the prison. Ramirez was transported from San Quentin's death row to Marin General Hospital, where he could receive more intensive medical care. However, his condition was too advanced for effective treatment, and it became clear that he was dying. The man who had terrorized California for over a year was finally succumbing to the long-term consequences of his lifestyle and the natural aging process. On the morning of June 7, 2013, Richard Ramirez died at Marin General Hospital. According to the coroner's office, The immediate cause of death was complications from B-cell lymphoma. The cancer had been exacerbated by his chronic hepatitis C infection and the long-term effects of his drug abuse. He was 53 years old at the time of his death. The announcement of Ramirez's death brought mixed reactions from victims' families and the general public. Some expressed relief that he was finally gone and could never hurt anyone again. Others felt that his natural death had cheated justice, as he had avoided the execution that had been ordered by the court. Reina Pinion, whose husband had fought with Ramirez during his capture, summed up this sentiment. "To me, he had a better death than all those people whose lives he took." The death of Richard Ramirez marked the end of one of the most notorious criminal careers in American history. His reign of terror had lasted only 16 months, but its impact on California and the nation extended far beyond that brief period. The Night Stalker case had changed the way people thought about personal safety and had influenced criminal investigation techniques for decades to come. The case demonstrated the vulnerability of suburban communities to random predatory violence. Before Ramirez, many middle-class families in California had felt relatively safe in their homes. The Night Stalker attack shattered that sense of security and forced people to acknowledge that no one was truly safe from a determined predator. The behavioral changes that resulted from the case — locked doors and windows, security systems, increased police patrols — became permanent features of life in many communities. From a law enforcement perspective, the Night Stalker case represented both a triumph and a learning experience. The investigation had required unprecedented cooperation between multiple agencies and had pushed the limits of available technology. The successful use of the EFIS fingerprint system in identifying Ramirez had validated the investment in new forensic technologies and encouraged further development of computerized investigation tools. The case also highlighted the importance of public cooperation in criminal investigations. The capture of Ramirez by civilians demonstrated that community involvement could be decisive in stopping dangerous criminals. This lesson influenced the development of more effective public awareness campaigns and community policing strategies. However, the Night Stalker case also revealed troubling aspects of American society, including the public fascination with serial killers and the tendency to glamorize or romanticize violent criminals. The phenomenon of groupies attracted to notorious killers, exemplified by Doreen Leo's relationship with Ramirez, raised disturbing questions about the psychology of evil and the media's role in creating celebrity criminals. Hashtag Chapter 9. The investigation that changed everything. The Night Stalker investigation represented a watershed moment in the evolution of criminal forensic science. The case showcased the potential of emerging technologies while also highlighting the continued importance of traditional investigative methods. The successful resolution of the case validated significant investments in new forensic technologies and encouraged further innovation in criminal investigation. The most significant technological breakthrough in the Ramirez case was the use of the Automated Fingerprint Identification System, AFIS. This computer-based system represented a revolutionary advancement over the manual fingerprint comparison methods that had been used for nearly a century. Before AFIS, comparing a crime scene fingerprint to existing records could take weeks, months, or even years. The new system could search through millions of records in minutes. The California AFIS system had been installed just months before the Night Stalker case reached its climax. When the fingerprint from Ramirez's abandoned car was submitted to the system, it produced a match in just 14 minutes. This rapid identification was crucial in preventing additional murders and demonstrated the transformative potential of computerized forensic databases. The success of AFIS in the Ramirez case led to rapid expansion of the technology throughout the United States and internationally. Law enforcement agencies that had been hesitant to invest in expensive computer systems were suddenly eager to acquire the technology that had proven so effective. The Night Stalker case became a selling point for AFIS vendors and a rallying cry for advocates of forensic technology advancement. Beyond fingerprint technology, the case also featured early use of DNA analysis in criminal investigation. While DNA fingerprinting was still in its infancy in the mid-1980s, investigators were able to use genetic evidence to link Ramirez to some of his crimes. This application of DNA technology helped establish its credibility and contributed to its eventual acceptance as a standard forensic tool. The Night Stalker case required an unprecedented level of cooperation between law enforcement agencies throughout California. Ramirez's crimes had occurred in multiple counties and cities, each with its own police force and investigative procedures. The successful resolution of the case demonstrated both the necessity and the difficulty of coordinating complex multi-jurisdictional investigations. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department took the lead role in the investigation, with Detective Gil Carrillo serving as one of the primary investigators. However, the case also involved the Los Angeles Police Department, the Orange County Sheriff's Department, the San Francisco Police Department, and numerous smaller municipal agencies. Each agency brought its own resources and expertise to the investigation, but coordination was often challenging. Detective Frank Salerno, who had previously worked on the Hillside Strangler case, provided crucial leadership in managing the multi-agency effort. His experience with complex serial killer investigations and his reputation within the law enforcement community helped ensure cooperation between agencies that sometimes had competing interests. The partnership between Salerno and the younger Carrillo became the operational heart of the investigation. The Night Stalker task force that emerged from this cooperation became a model for future multi-jurisdictional investigations. The task force included investigators, forensic specialists, and support personnel from multiple agencies, all working toward the common goal of identifying and apprehending the killer. Regular briefings and information-sharing sessions ensured that all participating agencies remained informed about developments in the case. The success of the multi-agency approach in the Night Stalker case influenced the development of formal protocols for handling serial crime investigations. Many states subsequently established procedures for automatically coordinating investigations when similar crimes occurred in multiple jurisdictions. The case demonstrated that serial killers who cross jurisdictional boundaries require a coordinated response that transcends traditional law enforcement boundaries. The relationship between law enforcement and the media in the Night Stalker case was complex and sometimes problematic, but ultimately proved crucial to the successful resolution of the investigation. The decision to release Ramirez's photograph to the public represented a calculated risk that paid off dramatically. Media coverage of the Night Stalker case was intense and often sensationalized. Television stations provided extensive coverage of each attack, newspapers published detailed accounts of the crimes, and radio stations offered regular updates on the investigation. While this coverage sometimes included information that investigators would have preferred to keep confidential, it also served important public safety functions. The public's response to the media coverage was remarkable in its scope and intensity. Citizens throughout California became active participants in the investigation, calling in tips and reporting suspicious activities. Gun stores and security companies experienced unprecedented demand as residents sought to protect themselves. The level of public engagement demonstrated how media coverage could mobilize entire communities in response to a criminal threat. The decision to release Ramirez's photograph represented a turning point in the relationship between law enforcement and the public in the case. Rather than relying solely on traditional investigative methods, authorities chose to enlist the entire population of California as potential witnesses. This strategy proved to be exactly what was needed to end Ramirez's reign of terror. The success of the public appeal in the Night Stalker case influenced law enforcement practices for decades to come. Police agencies became more willing to seek public assistance in high-profile cases, and systems were developed to manage the flood of tips that such appeals typically generate. The case demonstrated that an informed and engaged public could be law enforcement's most valuable asset in stopping dangerous criminals. The Night Stalker case had a profound impact on the development of victim services and support systems throughout California. The large number of survivors and their families created an unprecedented need for counseling, advocacy, and long-term support services. The response to this need influenced the evolution of victims' rights and support programs. Many of the Night Stalker survivors suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The random nature of the attacks and the extreme violence involved created psychological trauma that extended far beyond the immediate physical injuries. The need to address this trauma led to the development of specialized counseling programs for violent crime victims. The trial proceedings also highlighted the need for better support systems for victims and their families. Testifying about traumatic experiences in open court, often while facing the perpetrator, was itself a traumatic experience for many survivors. The Night Stalker trial led to reforms in courtroom procedures designed to reduce the secondary trauma experienced by victims during legal proceedings. The families of murder victims faced their own unique challenges in dealing with the aftermath of the Night Stalker crimes. Many struggled with grief, anger, and a sense of helplessness that was compounded by the extensive media coverage of the case. Support groups and advocacy organizations that emerged during this period continued to serve victims' families for decades afterward. The impact of the Night Stalker case on victim services extended beyond California. The high-profile nature of the case and the extensive documentation of victims' experiences provided valuable insights into the long-term effects of violent crime. These insights influenced the development of victim services programs throughout the United States and contributed to the broader victims' rights movement. The Night Stalker case represented an important milestone in the development of criminal psychological profiling as an investigative tool. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit provided assistance to the investigation, offering insights into the likely characteristics and behavior patterns of the unknown killer. This early application of profiling techniques helped validate the approach and contributed to its wider acceptance within law enforcement. The profile developed for the Night Stalker proved to be remarkably accurate in many respects. Profilers correctly predicted that the killer would be a young Hispanic male with a history of burglary and drug use. They also accurately anticipated that he would escalate his violence over time, and that he would likely have a fascination with Satanism or the occult. The success of profiling in the Night Stalker case led to increased interest in the technique among law enforcement agencies. Police departments that had been skeptical of psychological approaches to criminal investigation began to see the value of behavioral analysis. The case helped establish profiling as a legitimate and useful tool in serial crime investigations. However, the Night Stalker case also highlighted the limitations of psychological profiling. While the general profile was accurate, it did not provide specific information that led directly to Ramirez's identification. The case demonstrated that profiling was most valuable when used in conjunction with traditional investigative methods and physical evidence. The extensive study of Richard Ramirez's background and psychological development also contributed to the broader understanding of serial killer psychology. His combination of childhood trauma, head injuries, substance abuse, and exposure to violence provided insights into the factors that might contribute to the development of serial killing behavior. This research influenced both criminal investigation techniques and prevention efforts. Hashtag Chapter 10. The victims and their stories. The human cost of Richard Ramirez's reign of terror extended far beyond statistics and legal proceedings. Each of his victims was a unique individual with their own dreams, relationships, and contributions to their communities. Understanding their stories provides essential context for comprehending the true impact of the Night Stalker's crimes. Jenny Vincow, the 79-year-old woman who became Ramirez's first known victim, had lived a full life before her brutal murder in June 1984. A resident of Glassell Park, she represented the vulnerability of elderly citizens to predatory violence. Her death marked the beginning of a crime spree that would terrorize California for over a year. Dale Okazaki, 34, was a law student with a bright future ahead of her when she was murdered in March 1985. Her death, along with the attempted murder of her roommate Maria Hernandez, marked the beginning of the intense phase of the Night Stalker's activities. Okazaki's murder demonstrated that young, educated professionals were not immune to Ramirez's violence. Cillian Yu, 30, was killed on the same night as Okazaki, becoming the second victim of what would prove to be a double murder. Her death near her home in Monterey Park showed that the Night Stalker was willing to strike multiple times in a single evening. Yu's murder helped establish the pattern of violence that would characterize the case. Vincent and Maxine Zazera were 64 and 44 years old respectively when they were murdered in their Whittier home. Vincent was a successful businessman, and Maxine was his devoted wife. Their murder was particularly shocking because of the extreme mutilation that Maxine suffered, including the removal of her eyes. The Zazera murders demonstrated that financial success and suburban location provided no protection from the Night Stalker. Bill and Lillian Doy, aged 66 and 56, were attacked in their Monterey Park home in May 1985. Bill died from his injuries while Lillian, who was disabled, survived the sexual assault. Their case highlighted the Night Stalker's willingness to target the most vulnerable members of society. Mabel Bell, 83, and her sister Florence Lang, 81, were brutally attacked in their Monrovia home. Bell died from her injuries while Lang survived but remained traumatized. Their case was significant for the introduction of satanic symbolism, with pentagrams drawn on Bell's body and the bedroom walls. Joyce Nelson, 60, was beaten to death in her Monterey Park home in July 1985. A grandmother who had been warned to lock her doors, she had refused to be a prisoner in her own home. Her murder demonstrated the difficulty that law enforcement faced in protecting potential victims when the attacks appeared to be random. Maxine and Lela Needing, 68 and 66 years old respectively, were murdered in their Glendale home in July 1985. The couple had been beloved by their family and community, representing the glue that held their extended family together. Their deaths with a machete marked a new level of brutality in the Night Stalker case. Chainarong Covenanth, 32, was shot to death in his Sun Valley home while his wife and child were forced to witness the attack. His murder was part of the same night of violence that claimed the Needings, demonstrating the escalating frequency and intensity of Ramirez's crimes. Elias Abawath, 31, was murdered in his Diamond Bar home while his wife was sexually assaulted. His death occurred during one of the attacks that provided crucial evidence for the investigation. The trauma inflicted on his wife and young son demonstrated the lasting impact of the Night Stalker's crimes on surviving family members. The survivors of Richard Ramirez's attacks displayed remarkable courage both during their ordeals and in the aftermath. Their willingness to testify against their attacker and to provide crucial evidence to investigators was instrumental in ensuring his conviction. Maria Hernandez survived the attack that killed her roommate Dale Okazaki, becoming one of the first people to provide a detailed description of the Night Stalker. Her survival was due to a fortunate deflection of the bullet by her car keys, but her presence of mind in pretending to be dead likely saved her life. Her testimony proved crucial in identifying and convicting Ramirez. Whitney Bennett was only 16 years old when Ramirez attacked her with a tire iron while she slept. Her survival was attributed to what Ramirez apparently interpreted as divine intervention when sparks flew from a telephone cord he was using to strangle her. Bennett required nearly 500 stitches to her head, but made a full recovery and later testified against her attacker. Chris and Virginia Peterson both survived being shot during Ramirez's attack on their Northridge home. Chris Peterson's willingness to fight back despite his gunshot wound likely saved both their lives. Their survival provided investigators with detailed eyewitness testimony about the Night Stalker's methods and appearance. Sakina Abawath survived the attack that killed her husband Elias, despite being sexually assaulted while her young son was present. Her ability to untie herself and her child after the attack and to provide detailed testimony about the assault was crucial to the investigation. Her courage in testifying about her traumatic experience helped ensure Ramirez's conviction. Inez Erickson survived the attack that severely wounded her fiancé, Bill Carnes. Her testimony was particularly significant because Ramirez had identified himself to her as the Night Stalker. This self-identification provided crucial evidence of his awareness of his notoriety and his pride in his criminal activities. The courage displayed by these survivors extended beyond the immediate aftermath of their attacks. Many continued to suffer from post-traumatic stress and other psychological effects for years afterward. Their willingness to participate in the legal proceedings, despite the additional trauma this involved, demonstrated remarkable strength and commitment to justice. The Night Stalker's crimes created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate victims to encompass families, friends, and entire communities. The random nature of the attacks meant that no one could feel entirely safe, creating a climate of fear that affected millions of people. Peter Zazera, who lost his father Vincent and stepmother Maxine in one of the most brutal attacks, described how the murders ruined our entire family. The close-knit family dissolved within months of the attack, unable to cope with the trauma and grief. His experience was representative of many families who found that the violent loss of loved ones created wounds that never fully healed. Robin Sandoval, granddaughter of Maxine and Lela Needing, recalled how our grandparents had been the glue for our family. Their murder left the extended family struggling to maintain connections and traditions that had centered around the elderly couple. The loss of family anchors like the Needings had effects that extended across generations. Colleen Nelson, granddaughter of Joyce Nelson, was only 18 years old when she had to confront the reality of her grandmother's brutal murder. The experience of testifying at Ramirez's trial, where she had to look at the man who had killed her grandmother, was particularly traumatic. Her account of sitting in the courtroom while Ramirez would pull his glasses down and kind of check you out illustrated the additional trauma that court proceedings could inflict on victims' families. The impact on communities extended beyond individual families to affect entire neighborhoods and regions. Residents of the San Gabriel Valley, which bore the brunt of many attacks, fundamentally changed their daily routines and security practices. Homes that had never been locked began to resemble fortresses, and neighborly trust gave way to suspicious vigilance. The economic impact of the Night Stalker case was also significant. Sales of firearms, security systems, and other protective devices skyrocketed throughout Southern California. Some businesses reported decreased activity during evening hours as residents avoided going out after dark. The psychological trauma of the case translated into real economic consequences for entire communities. The healing process for Night Stalker victims and their families proved to be long and difficult. Many survivors continued to struggle with psychological trauma for years or even decades after the attacks. The random nature of the crimes and the extreme violence involved created particular challenges for recovery. Post-traumatic stress disorder became a common diagnosis among survivors. Symptoms included nightmares, anxiety, depression, and hypervigilance, all normal responses to abnormal and traumatic experiences. The development of specialized treatment programs for violent crime victims was partly inspired by the needs of Night Stalker survivors. The families of murder victims faced their own unique challenges in the healing process. Grief over the loss of loved ones was complicated by anger over the senseless nature of the crimes and frustration with the lengthy legal proceedings. Many family members found that the trial and appeals process prolonged their trauma by forcing them to relive the crimes repeatedly. Some survivors and family members found strength in advocacy work and victim support activities. Their experiences provided valuable insights that helped other crime victims and influenced improvements in victim services. The courage they displayed in sharing their stories helped reduce the stigma often associated with being a crime victim. The communities affected by the Night Stalker also engaged in collective healing processes. Memorial services, community meetings, and mutual support activities helped residents process their shared trauma. The experience of coming together to capture Ramirez provided a positive counterpoint to the fear and helplessness that had characterized much of the investigation. However, some effects of the Night Stalker case proved to be permanent. Many residents never returned to their pre-1985 security practices, maintaining higher levels of vigilance and protection. The case fundamentally altered perceptions of personal safety in suburban California and influenced behavior patterns for generations. #epilogue. Legacy of the Night Stalker. The Night Stalker case left an indelible mark on the American criminal justice system that extends far beyond the conviction of Richard Ramirez. The investigation techniques, technological innovations, and interagency cooperation models developed during the case influenced law enforcement practices for decades to come. The case demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of various investigative approaches. The successful use of the Automated Fingerprint Identification System, AFS, in identifying Ramirez validated the investment in computerized forensic technologies and accelerated their adoption nationwide. Police departments throughout the United States began investing heavily in similar systems, recognizing their potential to solve both new crimes and cold cases. The Night Stalker case became a powerful selling point for forensic technology vendors and helped establish the credibility of computerized investigation tools. The multi-jurisdictional cooperation required by the case also established new standards for handling serial crime investigations. The attention paid to Ramirez by admirers like Doreen Leoie highlighted the disturbing attraction that some people feel toward notorious criminals. This phenomenon raised important questions about the responsibility of media outlets in how they portray violent criminals. The Night Stalker case also influenced the development of criminal profiling as both an investigative tool and a form of entertainment. The public's fascination with understanding the psychology of serial killers led to increased interest in profiling techniques and the experts who employed them. This interest contributed to the popularity of crime dramas and documentaries that featured psychological analysis of criminal behavior. The case continues to influence popular culture today, with new documentaries, podcasts, and other media productions regularly revisiting the crimes and their impact. This ongoing attention demonstrates the enduring public fascination with the case and its broader significance in American criminal history. The Night Stalker case provides important insights into the nature of criminal behavior and the factors that can contribute to the development of extreme violence. Richard Ramirez's background included many of the risk factors that researchers have identified as potentially contributing to violent behavior: childhood abuse, head injuries, substance abuse, and exposure to violence. However, the case also demonstrates the limitations of simple explanations for criminal behavior. While Ramirez's troubled childhood may have contributed to his development as a killer, millions of people experience similar trauma without becoming violent criminals. The case illustrates the complex interaction of biological, psychological, and social factors that can lead to extreme antisocial behavior. The role of choice and personal responsibility in Ramirez's crimes also remains an important consideration. Despite his troubled background, he made conscious decisions to commit violent acts against innocent people. His lack of remorse and his pride in his criminal activities demonstrated a fundamental rejection of moral and social norms that went beyond simple psychological damage. The Night Stalker case also highlights the importance of early intervention in preventing the development of violent criminals. Many of the warning signs present in Ramirez's childhood and adolescence might have been addressed through appropriate mental health and social services. The case provides a cautionary tale about the potential consequences of failing to address childhood trauma and antisocial behavior. However, the case also demonstrates the resilience of communities and individuals in the face of extreme evil. The courage displayed by survivors, the dedication of investigators, and the solidarity of communities all provide positive examples of human response to criminal violence. These responses offer hope that evil can be confronted and overcome through collective action and individual courage. As the years have passed since Richard Ramirez's death, the full scope and impact of his crimes have become clearer. While he was convicted of 13 murders, investigators believe he may have been responsible for additional killings that were never definitively linked to him. The discovery of his DNA connection to the murder of 9-year-old Mei Liang demonstrated that his criminal activities extended beyond the known Night Stalker series. The financial cost of the Night Stalker case was enormous, including the investigation expenses, trial costs, and the ongoing expense of housing Ramirez on death row for 24 years. However, these costs pale in comparison to the human toll of his crimes. The psychological trauma inflicted on survivors and victims' families created wounds that in many cases never fully healed. The case also revealed important truths about the nature of justice and the limitations of the legal system. While Ramirez was convicted and sentenced to death, his natural death prevented the execution of the sentence. Some victims' families felt that justice had been incomplete, while others found closure in knowing that he could never hurt anyone again. The Night Stalker case serves as a stark reminder of the capacity for evil that exists within human nature. Richard Ramirez's crimes represented a level of cruelty and callousness that challenged basic assumptions about human decency. His embrace of Satanism and his pride in his violent acts demonstrated a complete rejection of moral and social norms. However, the case